Hi, everybody, and welcome to PPG, Purpose, Passion, Grit. I'm absolutely thrilled today to welcome Dr. Cindy Sughrue, who I know very well. She is the amazing director of the Charles Dickens Museum in London. And as all of you know, in the last couple of years, the culture kind of aspect of tourism in Britain has really gone through a battering with the pandemic, and Cindy has brought the museum through in a really amazing way. So welcome, Cindy. It's so good to have you here on Goldster today.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you for that very thoughtful and encouraging introduction. I have to say, I work with an amazing team, both a team of staff, an incredible team of volunteers, and a board of directors second to none. So I've been very well supported in the challenging years we've just managed to journey through.
So I know you've had a really varied career before you even came to the Dickens Museum, and I'd love to talk about that a bit first. But first, I want to know, how did you come to Dickens? What was your relationship with Dickens like before you joined the museum?
You know, it's funny because I can't honestly remember life before Dickens. And like millions of people the world over, my first introduction to Dickens was, of course, A Christmas Carol. So Christmas is one of my favorite times of year. And that book and that story and those characters have just been part of my life for as long as I can remember. So almost from birth, it was there. And then, you know, as many of us have experienced more Dickens at school. So the next Dickens I read, or the first one I read myself properly, was Oliver Twist when I was probably in primary 5 or 6, you know, sort of 11 or 12 years old, sort of the age of Oliver Twist himself. And that really spoke to me. And this novel that had a child at the center of it, you know, as the hero of the book. And that appealed to me. So I started to read Dickens both because I had to at school, but also for pleasure through my, you know, my early years and teens and into my 20s. But I have a particular relationship with Dickens that I'm not sure Lucinda even you'll know about. Is when I was 16, my parents died very close together in quick succession. And there were 4 of us kids in the family. There were myself and 2 siblings near to my age, and then a younger sister who's 10 years younger than me. She was 5 years old when my parents died. We were living in America at that time in Boston. And so there wasn't the sort of social welfare system there that there is here in the UK. There still isn't. And we were more or less left to our own devices to get on with life after my folks died. And that's when I thought I really gravitated back to Dickens's writing, because he wrote about orphans, he wrote about ship, and suddenly I thought, oh, this means something to me. It almost normalized being a sort of lost child, or you know, sort of a teenager who felt completely alone in the world, and how you get on. So that really, you know, galvanized or wedded Dickens to me in a way. And then as I discovered his other stories, there was always something about, you know, rooting for the underdog and how you would overcome the challenges before you, which was not about losing heart, but by just pulling yourself up and getting on with it and knowing through sheer determination and hard work, you'll succeed. So, you know, Dickens has been with me through the best and the worst of times throughout my entire life.
And when you came to the museum, you hadn't worked in anything to do with kind of Dickensian academia until that time, had you?
No, I've been a huge fan of Dickens for all of my life. But no, I worked in the cultural sector in everything from running a contemporary art gallery to an international touring company, and worked in, you know, festivals and theatres and in music ensembles, various things over the years. But I'd never worked in a museum, and I've never worked in a literary organization. So it felt like at this point in my career, as I sort of head toward the later years of it, I wanted to work in a different aspect of culture and heritage. And when the job came up, it was one of those thrilling moments. You know, it was that stomach doing the somersault, thinking, this is it. And I've always known that throughout my career, from the very first proper job through to this current one, is when the opportunity presents itself, I felt it and I thought, that's it. there's something thrilling, some possibility there. You feel you can make a difference, look after something, and hopefully hand it on in a better state than you found it. And that instinct was there straight away when this job came up, at a time that I was looking to move back to London after having been living in Scotland for 25 years.
And I seem to remember, because the job came up about 18 months before you applied, didn't it? And then it came up again. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's such synchronicity.
It was interesting because it came up that moment. I noticed it. And for various reasons, professional and personal, the time wasn't right. And I thought, oh gosh, is this going to be another job that you have to let go and it won't come up again for 10 or 20 years, and you sometimes let things like that go. And I thought, no, again, I thought exciting opportunity, not the right time. So I let it go, and you feel torn and slightly mournful. And so when it came up again, a year and a bit later, I thought, now's the time. It doesn't matter if I have to change a few things quickly. It spoke to me.
And it definitely was such synchronicity, because the person who'd been in post for just over a year had just suddenly found his dream job in a particular sector. So there was no kind of, other reason why that job would have come up, because as you say, normally these jobs don't come up. I mean, directors will often stay in post, as you say, for at least a decade. So it was really felt that you were meant to be there at that particular time when it was right in your life to move back down to London.
And one of the exciting things about any new job is you're working with and meeting a whole bunch of new people. And I found that not only was I coming into a museum team, a small team of staff, but a large team of enthusiastic and knowledgeable volunteers. And then also the Dickens Fellowship, which is this worldwide organization of fans and eminent scholars, anyone interested in Dickens. And it was a fellowship originally founded at the museum. So here was this other world of people, and the generosity and the welcome and the interest and enthusiasm for me coming into the museum was terrific. And it buoyed me up during some difficult times, some problems that you face in any new job. And then, of course, the pandemic and Brexit and all the challenges that we're still working our way through now.
And I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. And for those on the podcast, I'm putting in dickensmuseum.com and dickensfellowship.org. So tell us about the museum itself, the building, where it is, and what resonance it has with Dickens.
So we're located in two interconnected Georgian terraced houses in Doughty Street, so numbers 48 and 49. And 48 is the only house in which Dickens lived in London that still survives today. So we've reinstated the historic house as it would have been when Dickens lived here. And our collection spans the whole of his life, from a fragment of a letter he wrote as a schoolboy and the earliest portrait of Dickens by his aunt, Janet Barrow, through to the last portrait of Dickens on his deathbed, and everything beyond that. So his whole life and his legacy. So we have an enormous collection, very rich and varied. As you'd expect, there's correspondence and manuscripts, but there's also furniture, personal effects, artworks, the only clothing of Dickens known to survive, about 10,000 photographs. And so it's a very rich and varied collection, three-dimensional in so many ways. And much of it's on display, but we also have so much more that just simply can't be accommodated. And it was the Dickens Fellowship that acquired both numbers 48 and 49 Doughty Street in the 1920s. The two buildings came up at auction together. They weren't interconnected at the time, but they were both being run by a single proprietor as a boarding house, a small hotel and boarding house. So they came up together for sale, and the fellowship did a fundraising effort, a terrific effort, and purchased the two. And it was really forward-looking at the time, because they intended to set up 48 as a museum. They referred to it as a shrine to Dickens. So it could be this place of pilgrimage for people from all over the world. And they continued to rent out number 49 Dowdy Street to endow the museum. So it was something that just wasn't really thought about. How do you, invest in something to allow it to pay for the operation of a museum? And that gave us a really solid foundation in ways that many smaller historic house museums aren't facilitated. So that was terrific. And so yes, it was purchased in 1922 and opened to the public in 1925 on the 9th of June, so the anniversary of Dickens's death. And still in the lifetime of one of his children. It's amazing to think that the museum was set up when Dickens's children were still alive. So there would be
actually, it was two of his children. It was Katie and Henry.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I find that amazing that two of them were alive when this museum was open to their father. Gosh, it just seems incredible, to think that they were living well into the 20th century. And there was this man who was such a famous Victorian, who was born in 1812, that in the 1920s was still being, so revered. And imagine what it must have felt like for his children. I'd love to have been able to go back in time and see that. We have a comment here. I've been lucky enough to visit the museum in Doughty Street. Highly recommend a visit. Thank you very much for that. Did not pay that person to say that either.
But it's also fascinating because at that point where the fellowship itself was formed in 1902, so that was 32 years after Dickens died, and they were beginning to feel that there was a need to galvanize people together to preserve the legacy and promote the work of Dickens. And certainly that momentum was continued 20 years more to then establish the museum as a shrine, as a sort of foundation and a place of both pilgrimage and meeting and celebration for Dickens. And there was that fear already, that Dickens may be forgotten and he would disappear and his work would no longer have the impact that it does. But there hasn't been a single year when Dickens has been out of print. And I can't think of a year in recent memory, certainly not in the last 15, 20 years, when there hasn't been a new adaptation of one of Dickens's novels, whether it was an adaptation for television, cinema, radio. It's phenomenal to see. And there's a new Great Expectations coming out shortly with Olivia Colman as the do I mean that?
Yes, Olivia Colman's playing Miss Havisham.
Yes, yeah. We've had terrific Miss Havishams over the years. So I do sometimes think, as much as I adore Great Expectations, there are other titles. I would love to see someone tackle a lesser known Dickens title.
I totally agree. And I think
Barnaby Rudge.
That's just what I was about to say. We need a new Barnaby Rudge. There has not been a Barnaby Rudge adaptation that I can remember. But what do you think about all these adaptations? What do you think Dickens would have thought about the fact that his work is still being adapted today?
Oh, he would have been delighted and hugely flattered. He was a popular writer and an iconic figure of his day, and he perpetuated and courted that popularity. And I think he would have been chuffed beyond belief to think that 200 years on, he was still being celebrated in that way. And I think he'd be fascinated in the different media, because most people don't come to Dickens through reading. They'll come to him through one of the adaptations. Because it was such a great storyteller, it lends itself to performance. And I know myself, I consume most of my reading now through audiobooks, unabridged audiobooks, because I can listen to complete literature by wonderful readers, and I can be cooking or ironing or, and again, that notion of having someone tell you the story just adds something lit to it. And I think Dickens would be absolutely delighted to think his work is still being seen and appreciated all these years later.
I agree. And I also love listening to audiobooks. And I often think when I listen to Dickens adaptations, or Dickens, as you say, unabridged versions of his work, how he loved reading his own works and going on his reading tours, and how fantastic it is that career that he kind of started later in his life of going on these reading tours is still happening with great actors reading his works, that people can still hear them in the way that Dickens wanted them to be performed. I think that's really wonderful. So tell us about the fabric of the house. You've said that it was a Georgian house. What does it feel like? I mean, you're there right now, aren't you? What does it feel like to be in those walls?
Yes, and I never take it for granted. I get a little thrill every morning when I walk through the front door. And because this row of terrace houses was built about 1806 to 1809, so they're more modest in scale. So it feels like the sort of place you could call home yourself. It doesn't feel overwhelming. And the moment you walk through the front door, it feels welcoming, inviting. And because in the historic house, that side of the museum, we have so much of Dickens around us, that you feel the presence of him and his family. We have a very strong presence of his wife, Catherine Dickens, and their children, two of whom were born here. And the first one, Charlie, was only a matter of weeks old when he moved in. So you have that real sense of being in touch with Dickens and his time and his family. But I always, remind myself and also remind visitors that Dickens bought a lot of the things that we see on display brand new. He was, he followed fashion. He wanted the latest modern conveniences, the latest furniture, the latest styles for himself. We look around and say, oh, isn't it beautiful? And I would surround myself with antique furniture if I could. But of course, he was buying whatever was the latest. And he had, the means to do so eventually. So that to think of him as a contemporary, dynamic individual, I think helps us place his writing in a time, and yet the themes that he's writing about are so timeless as well. They're about love and loss and triumph over over evil and overcoming the challenges of life, and all those big human themes that never lose a place in our lives and in our hearts. But you have that sense of both being connected to historic Dickens, but a sense of him as this very contemporary, dynamic character. And so we like to give that experience to visitors when they come into the museum.
I agree. It has a wonderful atmosphere, and I always feel when I go in, it really feels like a family home. And I just love that. For those of you who don't know, I'm a patron of the Dickens Museum and a family member, and I find it fascinating that when I go there, I could totally imagine it still being a family home. It's the most lovely atmosphere there. Let's go back a little bit. You mentioned that you grew up in America. Tell us about your career before Dickens, because I know you've got an OBE for something that isn't even remotely connected to Dickens. So tell us about how you went. You've talked about your childhood. Your parents died when you were so very young. What led you to the UK and to your job in culture the culture sector?
Yes, well, I was so I spent my formative childhood and teenage years in America, and was studying. And of course, until fairly recently, university education was free here in the UK, which is a gift. But in America, you have to pay for it. So I had to work really hard for scholarships, and I managed to get a scholarship to come to the UK to my PhD. I was 22, just turned 22. And I was involved in dance. I can't remember, a bit like can't remember life without Dickens. I can't remember life without dancing or music or the arts and culture were always part of life. And those were the things that made, to me, life worth living. And so I wanted to pursue a career in the arts. So I started an early career in dance, but then moved into academia, out of academia, because I felt that at that time, we're talking about by the time I finished my PhD, it was the early 1990s, and jobs in academia were hard to come by. But I also knew I was a bit like Dickens. I needed to be involved in doing things. Dickens is a great doer, and I felt I needed to be out making things happen, not just studying and thinking. So at that time, I finished my PhD, and my partner at the time, we were trying to decide where to go. He was English, and I thought, well, whoever gets a job first somewhere, that's where we'll go. He got a job first up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, working for the British Geological Survey. So there I was going up to Scotland and looking for my first job. I did a bit of volunteering at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, as you do, my first summer there, and cut my teeth, even got some part-time work in the box office there. And then found my first job running a contemporary art gallery. I'd never done that before. I was amazed that they gave me the job, but there was something about it that intrigued me. It was a gallery dedicated to giving early opportunities to young artists. So it was called the Artist Collective Gallery. It's still there. It's called the Collective. It's moved a couple of times since, but it was about giving young artists a chance and a voice. And again, not everything is about Dickens, but it's amazing how much you can tie back to Dickens. Is that was something that Dickens did throughout his life. You know, he gave voice and opportunity to young or unknown artists, writers. And so that was something that really appealed to me. But and from there I moved on back into the dance world, a world I knew well. You know, like most little girls, I dabbled in ballet, but it became a bit more than dabbling for me. So I moved into the dance world in Edinburgh. I helped to establish what is now Scotland's National Centre for Dance. It still is called Dance Place in Edinburgh. And from there, I moved on and became the head of dance at the Scottish Arts Council, and eventually the chief executive and producer at Scottish Ballet. So dance became quite a key part of my life for about 15 or so years. And that's, in fact, I got my OBE for services to dance for all those years in Scotland. But as I say, I've moved throughout the cultural sector and moving into a different institution. Scottish Ballet was quite a large organisation, and after leaving there, I was looking for something where you know all your colleagues well and you have a sense of being connected. You know, there are jobs where you spend a lot of time solving problems and not much time being there for the art. And in a small historic house museum with a small team of staff, but a huge personality in Dickens and huge collection, there's that wonderful combination where you have to be immersed in the material, but you also have to understand how to run a successful cultural enterprise. It's a small business as well as a charity. So you have all those elements that I've learned over years of working in different cultural organizations and bringing them together behind this wonderful museum.
So I'm going to take us back to just the more recent history. So you came into the museum 7 years ago, and I know as a patron you have completely turned it around. It's been absolutely amazing, and you've got wonderful staff, as you say. But I think that's also down to hiring the right kind of people who will work together really well, which they do. And you have a wonderful team of volunteers. I'd love to talk about that in a little bit. But then we come on to the pandemic. And as you said, it's a charity. So tell us about the challenges that you and the museum faced during the pandemic.
I know it's almost terrifying to look back. But I was thinking about our interview here today. I looked back to 3 years ago, and it was the middle of February when we were already thinking there's something coming. And I was preparing papers for a finance committee meeting and saying, we just have to keep an eye on this. You know, I'm listening to all the advice coming through. But I should probably explain that we are at what's known as an independent museum. So this means, like about 2,000 museums across the UK, we don't receive regular revenue funding from the government or through a government agency like the Arts Council. We receive project funding and funding to redevelop, but there are a minority of museums that do receive regular funding to subsidise their operating costs. So we have to generate 100% of what we need to cover our core operating and programme costs through what we do every day here on site. So we were running very successfully, covering all our costs, and our costs would be covered through a combination of admission fees, sales in the shop, the cafe, private events, film facilitation fees. I'll use a Scottish word here, crofting. We were crofting together an existence from all different revenue streams, so really well balanced. But what we hadn't anticipated is a scenario where we would be forced to close for an extended period of time. So when we went into lockdown in March, on the 23rd of March, I think was the first day, we lost 98% of our income overnight. 2% of our income at that time was from our online shop. And that was, terrifying and, debilitating to start with. And okay, right, our reserves can eke out about 10 weeks, 12 weeks if we're lucky. And I know the government moved as swiftly as it could to put certain measures in place to, sort of support schemes, the furlough scheme that allowed us to furlough some of the staff and cover some of the staffing costs that way. But it was this just this overwhelming sense of, right, we've got to just buckle down and get on with it, save money, make money, whatever. And I still, I walk to work every day. It's a 4-mile walk. And on half of this walk, I see the BT Tower, that is known as the Post Office Tower, is a beacon. I can see it for about half my walk. And I always, on normal mornings, it has going around the top, good morning, London. And so I would always say, good morning to BT Tower. As we were moving toward lockdown and the museum's visitors completely disappeared in these few days leading up to that, emergency messages started appearing around the BT Tower. And that very first day of lockdown, they said, don't go home, don't go anywhere. It was stay home, national emergency, in black and yellow letters going around the top of the BT Tower. And it felt like a dream, or a film that you're in some Armageddon film. But what I did on that first morning of lockdown is I walked to work, as I always do, because this is a hugely important historic site, a house that needs to be looked after every day. Someone's got to come in, open the windows, allow the building to breathe. But at that point, I thought more importantly, make sure people know that there's someone here every day, because so many historic sites can become incredibly vulnerable to not only to thieves, but people stripping the lead off the roofs. So I thought, no, I must get there every day and look after the place and fulfill the orders from the online shop. So I was at first the only one coming in, and then a couple of members of the team started working, and then we were able to bring a few more people over time back in. But no, I was running the online shop remotely and running a fundraising campaign, trying to access every possible form of support. And also, give advice and be friends with our colleagues across the cultural sector. We were all trying to figure out what to do and how to survive. So we found that throwing yourself in there and, getting on with it, learning how to cope. I'm actually quite a good person in a crisis. A crisis gives you a focal point and it gives you purpose. And it was a generosity of people, including members of the Dickens family, who all, yourself included, Lucinda, did readings for us. So we got everyone on their mobile phones, and suddenly, from expecting everything to look like slick films, everyone was so forgiving. You could do something on Zoom or on a shaky mobile phone, and people would just be grateful to have a connection with another person. So just the love and support that came flooding into us from literally all over the world. People wanted to make sure this museum survived, and that we were really conscious that we wanted to give back. So we quickly got the Dickens family, our other theatrical patrons, doing things online for us. We made sure we were communicating with everyone as swiftly as we could, in our slightly hand-knitted way, but it was what was needed and what was deeply, deeply welcomed by everyone around the world.
And I know that after that first lockdown, and we were, worrying about what was going to happen to the museum, and then you were able to open again. And then, of course, we got closed down so suddenly at Christmas. Talk about that, because, of course, Dickens and Christmas have become synonymous.
Absolutely. So we were allowed to reopen in July of 2020. And we were determined as soon as we were allowed to reopen, we would. And we were very lucky to receive an emergency grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. They were giving out emergency grants that summer fairly quickly after the lockdown came in place. And that enabled us to bring some of the team back and reopen. And there were very few museums that opened at that time. We thought, no, in the spirit of Dickens, pioneering, we're going to get back there. Because if nobody opens, then no one's going to, see how it works. And we didn't have huge audiences, but people came back and they were so keen to be back doing something, seeing other people again. And our wonderful team of volunteers, who, again, it felt like they'd been thrown to the lions, they were back here welcoming visitors and reconnecting with each other again. So we reopened, and we had to do that under very tight restrictions of social distancing, sanitization, ventilation. So it was a whole operation as to how we could open safely for our visitors as well as our volunteers and our staff. And we adapted very quickly to this new way of working. And as we moved toward Christmas, which is a major season for us with Dickens and Christmas, we were hedging our bets, and we thought that the sort of news was suggesting that we might be heading toward another lockdown. So we had planned some in-person events, but we also quite cannily decided we must have some online alternatives. So we flipped our events program, which would normally be 2, sometimes 3 performances a day and lots happening here in the museum. We put it all online and made ourselves ready. So we had, I suppose, a local lockdown for 4 weeks in November, and then we were allowed to reopen. And then 10 days later, we were forced into what was our third and would become our longest lockdown period. But I can tell you, the team here, we became so adept at opening, closing, opening, closing. And you had to, but I was determined that we would be open anytime we were allowed to be so, because we had to get people back connecting with each other again. And if a small museum like ours couldn't trial it and make it work, then it was going to be harder for larger institutions. So I think we did that well. And I'm sure the fact that we are so far ahead in our recovery out of the pandemic and also weathering the related storms of Brexit and the cost of living challenges that we're all facing, I'm convinced that the reason why we're in a better position is because we got back out there and doing.
Yeah. Yes, tell us about the challenges of Brexit, because it's the real elephant in the room at the moment. You know, nobody's ever allowed to mention it on the media, and everybody pretends it's not happening. But you're there at the kind of coalface, as it were. What effect is it having on museums?
It affected us early on very quickly. I think the UK wasn't as ready as it might have been to make that transition. We had anticipated as much as we could what issues we might have with suppliers, and we made sure we were sourcing from within the UK. But a lot of our online shop patrons, customers, are international, so we knew there was going to be a knock-on effect of that. And also there was this sense, particularly in the first couple of years after the UK left the EU, that our European visitors might not come back. There was that sense of you wanted to leave us, and a little bit of a soreness, a hurt in that relationship. So we saw a little bit of that. But I'm really delighted to say that our European friends and neighbours are coming back to London, and I think the only benefit I can see of the very weak pound, with the UK economy being at one of its lower points in its history, is that the exchange rate is very favourable. So whether you have a euro or a US dollar, we're seeing that visitors are coming back and benefiting from the current exchange rate. But I think that London particularly is an incredibly international city, and we have more people from France living in London than many cities in France have. It's an incredibly connected population and community. I love the fact that on my 4-mile walk to work every day, I hear so many different languages, and they're not just tourists. And that became very evident during the pandemic when there were no tourists. That we're this incredibly international and connected city, as Dickens was. Dickens traveled abroad. He was fascinated with what was happening all over the world. And, he would, I think, it's hard to project back in time, but I suspect he would have wanted to stay as part of this union of Europe. He would have seen the benefits, not just personally and culturally, but also socially, and in terms of national security, being connected to many other countries in peaceful accord has got to be something that we would all want to see flourish and continue into the future. So I'm delighted to say we're seeing our European friends and neighbours come back again, which is delightful. But it's been a challenging time, and we've lost people who've worked here and people who volunteered here who weren't able to stay and have returned to their home countries in Europe. And it's a shame to see that a lot of our working population left as a result of Brexit. But I hope that is just a short-term impact and not a long-term.
I do hope so, and it's so sad that to have lost so many volunteers, because the Dickens Museum volunteers are so extraordinary. I mean, they're just wonderful people who give their own time and really build up their knowledge.
They're incredible, and they do everything. We have a lot of our volunteers will be on duty in the museum, answering questions, chatting to visitors, and they, some of them come to us just as Dickens fans, and they become incredibly knowledgeable through that. But we also have volunteers who support our curatorial team, so those that are perhaps studying museums or subject related to Dickens literature or Victorian history. But we also have two incredible volunteers who look after our garden. And if it weren't for these volunteers, the walled garden at the back of the museum is just beautiful. And they just quietly come in a couple of times a week and keep it ticking over, dealing with any sort of pests that there might be. We've got something on our hydrangea that we're tackling at the moment, planting new seasons, the spring colours out there. So, we've got an incredible array of volunteers that support all aspects of our work.
And I'd like to just give a little plug there for the museum garden, because it's one of those little hidden gardens of London, isn't it? It's not big, but as you said, it's a glorious little walled garden which you can go to from the cafe. And I remember talking to somebody once who said, when I'd been, I'd given a tour around, and then he said, "Oh no, you've shown everybody my secret garden. I work down the road and I come here for lunch regularly, and I'm quite glad that not enough people know about it." But it's just being there, and you hear bird song, and you have the little water feature trickling, and it does feel as if you're in another little world, as if you've gone back in time. So I would say to anybody, if you're in London and if you want somewhere to pop into that's just lovely and quiet, go into the Dickens Museum garden and imagine what it would have been like with Mr. Dickens sitting there composing perhaps his next story or his next cross letter or his next theatrical performance, whatever it might be.
And what we've tried to do as well, and again, our incredible volunteers have done research around this, is to plant as it would have been when Dickens lived here. So we're trying to reflect Dickens's own interest in horticulture, and he took a huge interest in his final garden at Gad's Hill Place. So we're trying to echo the plantings there so that visitors sitting in the garden will have that sense of an English country garden. It's small, but we do our best with the space we have.
And you mentioned a couple of times, you mentioned the Dickens Fellowship, and I think that this needs to have a little bit of explanation, actually. So tell us, you said you hadn't really known anything about them. Tell us what it was like as a layperson coming in and discovering this ancient organisation.
Yes, so I'm familiar with various learned societies. I've been a member of the Folklore Society for many years, and English Folk Dance and Song Society and others. But somehow, even though I knew the museum for years before I ever worked here, I think I first visited it in 1985 or 86, but I didn't know of the Dickens Fellowship. So it was fascinating to discover that the fellowship was this institution founded in 1902 and had become this worldwide network of fans and aficionados who come together to celebrate Dickens. And that voluntary organization had managed to fundraise, purchase these buildings, and establish the museum in those early years. It was incredible to think that there was that legacy of both scholarship and enjoyment. I think that's something with Dickens. He loved social gatherings. He enjoyed parties. He enjoyed performing to a room. But he enjoyed food and drink, and of course his work is all full of these wonderful descriptions. So that sense of enjoyment and coming together socially and to have fun and to have a laugh. And the Dickens Fellowship celebrates that. It isn't just a society that publishes an incredible journal, the Dickensian, which comes out 3 times a year, and that keeps everyone up to date with Dickens studies. So the Dickens, the Dickensian is a fantastic journal, but it isn't, a serious, full-faced institution. It's one that also wants to celebrate Dickens, and that anyone can get involved in. It's very accessible. I think it costs £15 or £20 to join for a year, and it's there to be a way that anyone can engage with and celebrate Dickens and his legacy.
And I love the word fellowship, and it really is a fellowship. I've travelled all over the world and met people from Dickens fellowships from here to Australia and New Zealand. And I remember being in India a few years ago and being taken to see Walter, one of his son's graves in India, by a historian there who'd been a member of the Dickens Fellowship. And the friendships that have formed with people who just know each other from different parts of the world because they meet at the conference is really fascinating. So tell us, you're actually involved in the conference this year, but it's not always in the UK, is it? Tell us a little bit about what's coming up.
No, it's the first time it's going to be in London for many years. I think it must be about 20 years since it was last in London. We were supposed to be having this conference in 2020, which would have been the 150th anniversary of Dickens's death. But sadly, the pandemic put paid to that. So this is it coming back to London a few years later. And so looking forward to that. So it kicks off on the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of July, and we'll be hosting the opening reception here. So again, in the spirit of Dickens, we'll be having a party to kick off and a couple of days of talks, fascinating program of talks coming together for that. And it's being held at Barnard's Inn, which is one of the Inns of Court. And of course, the Inns of Court appear in several of Dickens' writings, but of course, most famously, perhaps, in Bleak House and the extended case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. One of my favorite, if I had to choose a favorite novel, I think it would have to be Bleak House. It's really tricky. People ask me this all the time, but it has so many fascinating characters, and it conjures up this sense of London that you can still see. I can walk out the door here and walk just 5 minutes and I'll be in the neighbourhood of the Inns of Court. And what Dickens describes, you can still see there today. It's fascinating. So I think the conference is going to be a great celebration and coming back together in person for the first time since the pandemic. So this will be the first in-person conference since 2019.
I'm really looking forward to it. It'll be great to see people coming back. And if anybody is interested, the dickensfellowship.org website, they have information about the conference. So do find out about it there. If you've ever seen anybody wearing a little badge, a little scarlet geranium, little pin badge, that means they're a member of the Dickens Fellowship. And what I love is that you'll see people who will just be wearing that. Quite a lot of people wear them every day, and then they'll recognize each other, perhaps a bit like Freemasonry, and they know then. And there's this great camaraderie that comes up. I remember when we went out to the Dickens Fellowship conference in Carrara in Italy, which is one of the places that Dickens lived on his many times living overseas. And in fact, he visited Carrara when he was living in Genoa. And how great it was having people from all over the world converging in this small Tuscan town. And just this love of Dickens that was kind of being shared by everybody. What kind of memories do you have that you've particularly enjoyed since being at the museum and being involved?
Oh, memories generally, or of yes, I think the very first Christmas that I was here in 2015, because the team that I joined, they were saying, "Oh, Christmas," and there was a sense of, brace yourself because the world wants to be in Dickens's house for Christmas time, and it was absolutely right. And of course, it's really tricky because you want to give the public a great experience, and lots of people want to visit on Christmas Eve. And yet you've got a team of staff here who also want to travel to be with their loved ones for Christmas Eve. So, there were a few of us raised and ready, but it was just a joy to see people coming in and just wanting to be connected to Dickens and his writing at that time of year. So every year, I'm the first one to say, I will absolutely be on the front line on Christmas Eve because I want to be there and to make this house and everything we have in it available to people at that special time of year. But there have also been some terrific exhibitions. We have a rolling program of special exhibitions, and this allows us to draw out certain themes about Dickens and his work. and to bring out aspects of our collection that might not be on display normally. And in fact, we occasionally still acquire new material for the museum's collection. And there was a huge campaign. In fact, we just acquired it not long before the pandemic. Was what was known as the Lost Portrait, this gorgeous portrait of Dickens that was discovered in South Africa, of all places. And it had been a portrait that the Dickens world had assumed had been lost and was gone forever. It hadn't been seen in about 150 years. And it was rediscovered. And I can quickly, before we finish, I've got it here.
Oh, fantastic. This is really exciting. The first time I saw this portrait, I got goosebumps on the back of my neck. It's the most incredible portrait. And for those of you who saw my program at Christmas with Miriam Margolyes, Miriam's Dickensian Christmas, we witnessed look on her face when she saw it for the first time. And this is it. It's so gorgeous. And for those of you who are listening to this on the podcast, you need to just look up on the internet Dickens' Lost Portrait, and you can see this beautiful image of Dickens as a young man. It's just wonderful, isn't it, Cindy?
Because it's such an unlikely portrait of Dickens. If you ask anyone to draw a picture of Charles Dickens, it will inevitably be the old man with the scraggly beard, disheveled hair, looking very serious, the elder statesman. But, he was young once too. And, this was Charles Dickens when he was writing A Christmas Carol. He was 30 years old. He was a young man. And there's something about this portrait, and you can see it online, and it's so alive. It's, beautifully painted by Margaret Gillies, who was a miniaturist, and there is something really alive in his face and his eyes, and you get a sense of the dynamism of Dickens. People who knew him described him, and he was forever on the move. He was effervescent and dynamic, and he'd be the sort of personality who'd walk into the room and you couldn't not notice him. You just couldn't take your eyes off of him because he just had that charisma and that energy. And this portrait captures that. I often think, what a shame he died about 20, 30 years before moving image or before audio. So we don't have his voice and we don't know what he moved like. But, the description of him is, this person who would hardly sit down, he'd be forever off and out, walked at a pace that would leave the rest of us breathless. He was just this fizzing ball of energy. And this portrait begins to capture that sense.
We've got a comment here, or question rather. Having looked at that portrait, it makes me wonder, have you ever seen Dickens's ghost in the house? Or any
No.
ghost, indeed?
No, I haven't. And I'm a skeptic when it comes to ghosts. And in fact, we have a special exhibition on at the moment, all about Dickens and his fascination with ghosts and the supernatural. So I've never sensed any ghostly presence, and I'm here often on my own. I certainly was during the pandemic, but I'm often the last one out at night. Although I have a colleague who senses something not in Dickens's house in number 48, but in the other side of the museum, number 49, which is in fact where this office is. So I'm in the attic of 49. But I'm open to ghosts, but I've never had an encounter. So yes, Dickens's ghost, I don't think, if his ghost is anywhere, I don't think it would be here in Downton Street. I suspect it would be at Gad's Hill out in Higham near Rochester in Kent. I think that's where he spent his last years there, but I think that's where he was the most settled in his life.
I don't think he'd be in one place. I think he'll be off in Paris. He'll be wandering around Italy. He'll be going back to Canada and America.
That's true.
I think he'll just be saying, I'm not staying in one place. I never did in my life. I'm not going to be hidebound to just stay in one place. That for Dickens would be absolute torture, wouldn't it? His ghost being
so he could turn up at Niagara Falls because, of course, he visited that on one of his.
There.
So if anyone ends up there, people watch for Dickens's ghost.
There's a lot of places in the world you can go to and discover there are Dickens connections, which I know. I'm sure you've discovered lots of them, Cindy, as well. But when you go anywhere, they say, oh, yes, Dickens was here. Sometimes he actually wasn't. But, there are so many places that he travelled to. So I know we have to let you go soon, but I just wanted to ask, you've seen the museum through the pandemic. What is your next goal for the Dickens Museum, or for
Well,
you?
we have an imminent milestone on the horizon, which is the museum's centenary. So 2025 will be 100 years since the museum is here. So we're currently planning for what we want to do during the course of that year, but also things that we want to achieve by the time we get to 2025. This will sound like a really dull thing, but cataloging our collection. What that means is our collection is well over 100,000 items, and we suspect it's much more than that. But cataloging means doing a detailed description and notes about every single item, but also giving its historic and contextual background. So it's a very detailed job. And I don't think there's a museum in the world whose collection is fully catalogued. You know, even big ones like the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, still has a huge vast uncatalogued. But we're in the middle of a project just now to get everything catalogued. So our deadline is to get it done by 2025. And as part of that, we are digitizing our collection so that eventually all of it will be available online. That doesn't mean we don't want people to come to the museum. Please come to the museum. But it means that so many more people all over the world will be able to access this extraordinary collection of material we have connected to Dickens' life and work.
You said that sounds boring. As an author and researcher, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And I wish everywhere did. I know a lot more happened during the pandemic. A lot of places have managed to digitize more of their collections, but that's such a great ambition for the museum. Thank you. We've got a couple more comments here. I would like to visit the museum one day. Please do. It's open 5 days a week, isn't it, Cindy?
Yes, Wednesday to Sunday. So we're closed on Mondays and Tuesdays. Once we've fully recovered from the pandemic, we'll reopen on Tuesdays again. So our normal operating model is 6 days a week. We take Mondays, not off. We're here always on a Monday. But that's when our curators get a chance to actually, properly clean and organize the historic house and set up new exhibitions and so on. But yes, come and see us.
And I think that this will have to be the last comment, but it's such a poignant one. Such a pity that The Lost Portrait isn't the most popular one of Dickens, and not the usual one, which portrays him as an older man who looks less vibrant and weary from all his travel and work. I totally agree.
And I think as well, because by the time he was, well, actually, this portrait, which was made while Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol in 1843, photography was, in its infancy then. But as Dickens progressed through life by the 1850s and 60s, there were so many photographs of Dickens because he was this hugely popular figure at home and all over the world. So there are so many more images of Dickens photographed as an older man with the beard, the facial hair, and so on. So that's why I think he's known as the elder statesman, because there's just so many more images of him. But this is my favorite image of Dickens. I think it just brings him to life in a way, and reminds us all that our career is simply a journey from one stage in life to the next, and I'm now approaching my 60th year, and I still think I'm about 25, and I know Dickens. This is the Dickens when he was on his deathbed. That's the Dickens that was there.
Absolutely. Yes, I think we definitely all know that. Thank you so much, Cindy. I think on Goldster, everybody feels they have that inner Dickens as they're all 30 still, or 20 or 15, or however old or young you want to be. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much. And I do hope that you'll come back in the future and tell us what happens next. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to let Cindy go now. I'm just going to very quickly tell you what is coming up this week. On Thursday, I'm interviewing Marika Kobold. She's written more books than this, but she's a wonderful author. This is her first, and this is her last. I had to let Cindy go because she had another event she had to get to now. Marika Kobold, it's great. Come along to the book club on Thursday. And then, I don't know how many of you have read this. This is our book of the month on Friday, Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. I can't recommend this book enough. It is glorious. Please, please, please read it. If you haven't read it, still come along on Friday, though I can't guarantee there'll be no spoilers, but come along and chat about it. It is the most gorgeous book. I'm really, really glad I know about it, and I hope that you will all come along as well. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. I hope to see you on Thursday and Friday. Thank you, Joe, and I will see you all on Thursday and Friday. Take care. Bye.